So, hi everyone. Just to give you a little bit of background, since we were urged to do this in the beginning, and I think it is helpful for people who come from lots of different disciplines. My work is mostly around power and politics and online communities. I was for many years involved in the free and open source software movement as an activist in South Africa mostly, and for many years was involved in things like Creative Commons and Wikipedia. And I went back to university to become an academic when I realized that a lot of the promises that were being heralded by the rise of new technologies, specifically around their ability to represent diverse viewpoints around the world, were not actually coming to fruition. And what I realized was that even though the technologies might have been available, there were some really important social and political dynamics that were influencing how we take up technology, and specifically how we come to know things about the world and how knowledge is defined, basically, and the politics around that. So that's where I'm coming from, and that's my interest. And my academic background is in information systems and media and communication, I guess, and science and technology studies. So I recently did an ethnography of Wikipedia, and there have been a few ethnographies actually of Wikipedia. Most recently, Jamel Niak has written a great Wikipedian kind of biography, I guess. And in contrast to Jamel Niak and others, I look at Wikipedia through the lens of the dispossessed, I guess, and a newcomer. So I interview and I speak to a lot of people who feel very disappointed with Wikipedia. But I also celebrate a lot of what Wikipedia is about. So when I say that I'm going to do an ode to the Infobox, and I have actually written an ode. It is a terrible ode, but I will hope to do it. Can you let me know when I have 5 minutes left, and then I'll do it. I will say my ode. Very short, bad ode, but it's an ode. And when I talk about doing an ode, so an ode is a poem, a celebratory poem about something. Keats wrote a lot of them, about nightingales and things. It's kind of a tongue-in-cheek celebration of the Infobox, which I've come across in my travels. And not so much the Infobox as a great thing, in the sense of it being all positive, but the Infobox definitely as being very powerful and significant, and emblematic, I think, of a lot of what's changing in the world right now, and in Wikipedia in particular. So, and I'm particularly going to be talking about basically arguing that these Infoboxes are emblematic of a struggle that's taking place over who gets to decide what knowledge is, what knowledge consists of, and what authority and expertise are required in order to represent knowledge. And I actually think that what's happening right now, and has happened in very few years, the last few years, in the rise of semantic web technologies and their influence on Wikipedia and other sites, there's actually been a changing of the guard, and that this is really significant. So just to show you a few Infoboxes, it was the most frustrating thing to do this talk, because every time I wrote Infoboxes on Keynote, it kept changing it to inboxes. So while I recognize the significance of Infoboxes, the powers that be do not. So Infoboxes in the wild. From the front, let's have a look at what an Infobox is. And basically it's a text box that summarizes key facts about the subject. I started my life as a designer where I'd actually paste in paper text boxes or Infoboxes. And these are similar, right? So we have an Infobox here about Coventry. That's on Google when you search for Coventry. It's actually from more recent addition to Google search in the form of the knowledge graph. We also have an Infobox here from Wikipedia on Coventry, and it's available in numerous languages, so the Infobox will change according to the language edition that you're looking at, and my personal favorite, this Infobox from the BBC. So Infoboxes are everywhere we look, summarizing the salient facts about a particular phenomenon, and also actually designating that phenomenon as important. So behind the hood, what Infoboxes do nowadays is that they emit machine-readable metadata. So you can imagine this little Infobox sending out these signals and forming these channels, I guess, these streams across the web. And basically, in its very basic format, it is nothing more than this. It's called a key-value pair, and an Infobox is constructed out of numerous key-value pairs, and a key-value pair is, in this example, Bugs Bunny is located on Earth, where the key will be a keyword that's used throughout the database and will have a value. So Infoboxes nowadays on Wikipedia especially are mostly constructed out of these metadata elements. And so you can see behind the hood again what it looks like, what an Infobox looks like behind the hood. There's some very simple wiki text for anyone to edit that displays an Infobox. And we have here the new project of the Wikimedia Foundation called Wiki Data, which not a lot of people have been talking about, but is really important in this story about Infoboxes. Now, Infoboxes are important because they form the fodder of artificial intelligence systems. We know that Watson and Siri, for example, include facts from Wikipedia's Infoboxes. Google's knowledge graph and the majority now of all of the major search engines all not only include Wikipedia Infobox data, they actually prioritize that data. So that if you could do a search now for yourself or someone pretty famous, it'll come up with information that is sourced and attributed to Wikipedia. So Infoboxes are important. And I argue that they're important as concentrations of power and authority in data streams. So the importance of looking at facts, I think, facts are a very particular type of data, right? Facts are seen as authoritative types of data, and Infoboxes as their official housing have a particular type of authority. And authority is a kind of power, the power to give orders, to enforce obedience. And the Infobox has trained us to look to it for the most important information about a subject and to recognize the information contained within it as important. And that's, as I said earlier, I think this is important in terms of new centers of authority and expertise emerging. So let's talk about some Infobox wars. This is a thing. Infobox wars are happening probably as we speak on Wikipedia. Now there's many different types of Infobox wars. One of them is about whether facts included in a particular Infobox are accurate or not. The second is, what are the most salient facts to include in an Infobox? So this is about selection and summary of data. The third is, should there be common fields for particular types of Infoboxes or all Infoboxes? And fourth and finally, should an Infobox exist on every page? Now, these may seem like technical, simple questions, but they actually are pretty significant in terms of the way that we define knowledge today. So one of my case studies in my thesis was looking at the 2011 Egyptian Revolution article on Wikipedia, on English Wikipedia. I looked at hundreds of edits over time in the first few weeks of the protests. And I interviewed editors about how they collaborated with one another and did some analysis of the talk pages. And this is when I first came across Infoboxes and recognized how significant and important they were, because the Infobox of the first version of the article was actually inserted in a version of the article that happened, that was produced a day before the first event on the 25th of January 2011. So this is a kind of, Infoboxes are being enrolled in this kind of strategic political work that is necessary if you want to be in charge or own the representation of history and national history. So this Infobox, and you can see the first version of it over here, they couldn't include a photograph as you might usually see on an Infobox, and that's how it looks now, or a day or two ago. The first version, they couldn't include a photo because it hadn't happened yet. The event hadn't happened yet. So you can see some really interesting kinds of strategies being employed. And the most important image there was a cartoon, actually, that was part of a series of cartoons that were used by activists on the streets in January. And there were lots of arguments then about what to name the article. It was first called the 2011 Egyptian protests, and people argued about when and whether it should change to the revolution. And we saw things like, what are the characteristics of this event that hadn't yet taken place, and things like demonstration, riots, or self-immolation, and all these kinds of things being debated and defined on Wikipedia. And now we have causes of the event being listed in this Infobox. So a lot of really strategic information power play happening here in defining what this event would become, and was instrumental. The visioning and the framing of this event was instrumental in how other countries, namely the US, actually saw the events in Egypt, and thus were very, very important to try and shape. Now, I've looked at lots of Infobox Wars on articles, but the Infobox Wars that happened along the lines of the kinds of debates that I outlined in 3 and 4 of my list. So these are about, should Infoboxes exist on every kind of page, on every page on Wikipedia, were actually the most interesting and probably the most significant. In 2013, there was a massive arbitration committee meeting to discuss the ongoing debates and conflict, interpersonal conflict that was happening on articles, and they were specifically related to history, biography, and music. Well, predominantly those 3 subjects. Now, arbitration committee can't really decide on editorial matters, but the problem arose basically because Infoboxes were being edited behind the scenes, not by people who were subject matter experts, who were actually watching the page, who were experts in the particular subject, or at least felt that this was in their area of interest, but actually were being edited by people, or data experts basically, who were trying to insert Infoboxes on numerous pages automatically. And what this ARBCOM decision was that, well, I'll leave it a little bit. I'll tell you that a bit later. But so let's first look at, okay, they were actually called pro boxes and anti-boxes. And the pro boxes were saying that Infoboxes are, they aid readability, so they enable efficient access to information. The second big thing was Google's doing it anyway. So they said, if you search for some person or event on Google, it will extract data from Wikipedia even if there is no info box. So we might as well do it because Google's doing it anyway. The third is that it enables for very personalized or targeted queries. So people are saying if you develop these info boxes, especially if they're semantically organized, then you can target them, people can extract them for their own purposes, and this is really helpful in the terms of the open web. The anti-boxes were saying that they're repetitive, that there were monster boxes that were too long because it's easier to add than to remove, and that they were reductive. Now, I'll leave this one because I'll look at one disenchanted user who actually who wrote this wonderful essay about Wikipedia becoming a database. And this was written in late 2012. He retired in 2013. His name is Rigor Mortis. It's quite apt, actually. So he was upset, and this was the last straw, basically. He said that this move towards putting info boxes on every single page by extracting all the supposedly relevant or salient information about a subject and reducing this knowledge to these key value pairs, he said that Wikipedia will gradually become a pseudo-encyclopedia, with each page having been tailored more to pretty info boxes and the emission of metadata than to human learning. Yeah, you know, the hard job to write and to share understanding. And I mean, I urge you to read this wonderful essay because it's filled with such amazing insight, and also just so despondent about the world. And basically, the decision in this particular outcome case was to distinguish what was determined to be content versus maintenance. This is an ongoing debate because certain people are not allowed to do content and certain people aren't allowed to do can only do content. And the decision by the worm that turned, who was the arbitrator in this case, was that including an info box in an article is a content decision. It is not a maintenance decision. Now, reading through all this documentation about these wars, these Infobox wars, it made me realize something about these wars. And in a way, the wars weren't about who was right, about what kinds of accuracy or inaccuracy could result from deploying this Infobox. The wars were about who was in charge, right? Is this a content decision or is this a maintenance decision? Would bots be allowed to automatically add info boxes to these articles or would they not? You said you were going to give me 5 minutes. Before. Oh, you did, but I didn't see. Sorry. So who won the Infobox wars? I will leave that up to you. In a war that was positioned as efficiency, choice, standardization, uniformity, and accessibility against ideas like nuance, context, local, and knowledge, we can imagine who won. So I'm going to leave you with my ode because, you know, I have time. So, oh, Infobox, you may not be made of wood or steel or iron. But, oh, Infobox, you constrain the facts you house just as well as the strongest iron box holds the keys within it. We may reshape your frame, we may move your facts around, but you have trained us to recognize your authority, and so we dare not. From your immense organizing power, you have been recognized as the source, not only of facts, but of knowledge, a wellspring from which to extract the essence of what we humans know about the world. But is this knowledge, oh Infobox? Do we really inhabit the facts you contain in the way that true knowledge must live inside us? You make and remake the world in every iteration, from the moment we bring you into being. So I ask you, oh Infobox, what you do, what you contain, come from us or from you. That was the first time I've read a poem, so thank you very much for your attention.